On our 15th anniversary, I received divorce papers instead of flowers. Clayton laughed when I called him. "Time for an upgrade," he said. 3 weeks later, his smug smile vanished when my lawyer revealed I'd been the majority owner of his business for the past 5 years. I still remember the weight of the manila envelope in my hands. Our anniversary morning, 15 years of building a life together. The return address was from Clayton's attorney, not the jewelry store he'd been dropping hints about for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside weren't diamond earrings, but divorce papers, cold and official, with a yellow sticky note marked, "Sign quickly for a generous settlement." The kitchen island where I stood, imported Italian marble that Clayton had insisted on, suddenly felt like a stranger's home. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the carefully curated space we'd designed together. Or rather, that I had designed while Clayton nodded approvingly at the elements that would impress clients and colleagues during dinner parties. My hands didn't shake. My coffee remained steady as I placed the papers on our kitchen island, the one Clayton had insisted we needed during the renovation last year. The renovation I'd paid for, like most things in our life together. I remember thinking how fitting. It was that he would choose our anniversary for this. Clayton had always appreciated symmetry in business dealings, the poetic justice of closing a cycle on the same date it began. He applied that same calculating precision to everything, even the dismantling of our marriage. I picked up my phone and called him. He answered on the third ring. "Nikki, surprised to hear from you this early." His voice carried that artificial cheerfulness he used with difficult clients. "I got your delivery," I said, my voice calmer than I expected. "Ah, well, these things are better handled quickly and quietly." A pause. "I've been meaning to have this conversation for a while." "On our anniversary?" He laughed then, a sound I once found charming but now recognized as the same laugh he used when outmaneuvering competitors. Seemed fitting. End things. On the same day they began. Time for an upgrade, you know. For both of us. That laugh. It transported me back 15 years to when I'd first heard it across a crowded networking event. Clayton Brooks had been magnetic then. Tall, ambitious, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but never quite crossed the line. We'd been introduced by a mutual colleague who thought our complementary skills might make for good business. Partners. Neither of us had anticipated becoming life partners as well. "And the business?" I asked, referring to Meridian Consulting, the firm we'd built from nothing in our spare bedroom. The firm that now occupied 3 floors in a downtown high-rise and employed 68 people. Our business had been our first child, in many ways. Born in late-night strategy sessions and weekend sacrifices. Nurtured through difficult early years when we'd foregone salaries to reinvest in growth. Matured under our complementary guidance, Clayton's visionary client acquisition, paired with my methodical operational expertise. "Don't worry about that," he said with practiced smoothness. "My lawyer has worked everything out. You'll be comfortable. Nikki, just not involved anymore." The casual dismissal of 15 years building Meridian together stung more than the divorce itself, as if my contribution had been peripheral rather than fundamental. As if the countless nights I'd spent perfecting our financial models, refining our service offerings, and developing our internal systems had been mere busy work while Clayton did the real work of charming clients. After we hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I texted Lucia Martinez, our corporate attorney. "It's happening. Activate Protocol Winter." Her response came immediately. "Understood. Meeting at 2 p.m., Hamilton Building, Suite 512, bringing Erica. Protocol Winter." We'd established it 3 years ago when I first discovered Clayton's affair with Stella Reynolds, our then Director of Client Relations. I hadn't confronted him then. Instead, I'd quietly begun restructuring our company and our lives, preparing for the day that had finally arrived. I'd met Lucia during Meridian's second year, when we'd outgrown the legal template services we'd been using. From the beginning, she'd impressed me with her strategic thinking and ability to anticipate problems before they materialized. Clayton had been less enthusiastic, viewing legal counsel as a necessary expense rather than a strategic partner. "She's too detail-oriented," he'd complained after our first meeting with her. "We need someone who can move quickly, not someone who sees obstacles everywhere." "Those details are what protect us," I'd countered. "And she doesn't see obstacles. She sees potential problems we can avoid with proper planning." It was an early glimpse of a fundamental difference in our approaches: Clayton's bias toward speed and my insistence on thoroughness. In the early days, we'd balanced each other well, but as the company grew, so did Clayton's impatience with what he called administrative constraints. The signs had been there for years, if I'm honest with myself. Clayton gradually taking sole credit for our joint successes, the separate bank account he thought I didn't know about, client meetings I was mysteriously excluded from, the way he began referring to my company instead of our company at industry events. There had been a particular board meeting 3 years ago that should have been my wake-up call. Clayton had presented a 5-year growth strategy that prominently featured his vision but made only passing reference to the operational infrastructure that would support it, my domain. "The market is moving quickly," he'd explained smoothly when I raised concerns privately afterward. "We need to focus on growth, not processes. Trust me on this, Nikki. I know what I'm doing." I had trusted him. That was perhaps my biggest mistake. Not the trust itself, but the failure to verify that the trust was still earned as circumstances changed. I wasn't completely blindsided when I discovered the messages between him and Stella 3 years ago. I was preparing a surprise weekend trip for our 12th anniversary when a notification popped up on his synced iPad. "Can't wait until she's gone, and Meridian is truly ours." The message had appeared while I was checking reservation details, the iPad automatically syncing messages from Clayton's phone. I still remember the physical sensation, like missing a step on a staircase, that momentary vertigo before reality reasserts itself. I'd read more messages, enough to understand that she meant me, that ours meant Clayton and Stella's, that my husband and our director of client relations were not only having an affair, but actively planning my professional removal. That night, after Clayton fell asleep, I silently moved through our home, office, photographing documents, downloading files, and forwarding emails to a secure account. Not in anger, but in self-preservation. Clayton had taught me that himself. In business, always secure your position before making a move. The business principles he'd imparted to me over the years would become the very tools I'd use to protect myself from him, an irony that wasn't lost on me even then. The next day, I scheduled lunch with Lucia Martinez, who had been our corporate attorney since the early days. Clayton had always underestimated her, viewing her as the paperwork person rather than the strategic legal mind she was. "He's planning something," I told her over salads at a restaurant far from our usual business haunts. Lucia didn't seem surprised. "I've noticed some irregularities in recent contracts, clauses that weren't run by both of you, approval signatures that came through unusual channels." "How long has this been happening?" I asked, maintaining my composure despite the sinking feeling in my stomach. 6 months, perhaps longer," she replied, her expression carefully neutral. "I assumed you were aware but had delegated more authority to Clayton." I shook my head. "What do I need to do?" Her answer was measured. "First, we document. Then, we restructure. Quietly." That meeting became the first of many. We established Protocol Winter, named after my favorite season, when everything appears dormant, but life continues beneath the surface. Together with Erica Blackwood, our most trusted financial advisor, we restructured Meridian's ownership while maintaining its daily operations exactly as Clayton expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Erica had come to us from a major consulting firm 3 years earlier, attracted by Meridian's growing reputation and the opportunity to help shape our financial strategy. She'd quickly become invaluable, not just for her technical expertise, but for her ability to translate complex financial structures into strategic advantages. The key, Erica had explained during one of our planning sessions, is to use legitimate business reasons for every restructuring step. Nothing we do should appear reactive or defensive. And so we had proceeded methodically. The expansion funding round provided the perfect opportunity to adjust ownership structures. Clayton had been so focused on securing the capital and impressing investors that he'd signed the reorganization documents with barely a glance, certainly without reading the details that placed majority control under North Star Holdings, my separate LLC. "He's signing away control," I had whispered to Lucia during that meeting, watching Clayton scrawl his signature across page after page. "He's signing away the ability to exclude you," she had corrected. "There's a difference." The restructuring wasn't about revenge. It was about protection of the company we'd built, the employees who depended on us, and the legacy that was being threatened by Clayton's ambition and infidelity. Over the next 3 years, I maintained our marriage as if nothing had changed. I attended company functions on Clayton's arm, managed key client relationships, and continued building Meridian's reputation, all while documenting every instance where Clayton bypassed proper protocols, diverted company resources, or made decisions that should have required joint approval. I also diversified my personal investments, secured copies of all our financial records, and built stronger independent relationships with our most significant clients. Not because I wanted our marriage to fail, but because I'd learned from Clayton himself: hope for the best, prepare for the worst. The preparation had been meticulous but emotionally exhausting. Every day of performing normalcy while gathering evidence of betrayal had taken its toll. I'd developed the ability to compartmentalize with surgical precision: wife and business partner in public, strategic defender in private, which brought me to this morning, divorce papers on our anniversary, and a meeting with Lucia in 4 hours. I spent those hours not in despair, but in final preparations. I transferred personal items to the secure storage unit I'd rented 2 years ago. I backed up the household computer to an external drive. I photographed every room in our home, documenting assets that Clayton might conveniently forget during settlement negotiations. The house itself, a modernist showcase in an exclusive neighborhood, had never felt like a true home. It had been Clayton's choice, selected more for impression than comfort. The condo I'd secretly purchased downtown better reflected my personal taste: warm minimalism rather than cold opulence. At 1:55 p.m., I walked into Suite 512 of the Hamilton Building, a law office I'd never visited before, deliberately chosen by Lucia to avoid any connection to Clayton's network of business associates. Lucia and Erica were waiting, along with Stanley Weber, a distinguished divorce attorney I'd quietly retained 6 months earlier when Clayton began staying late at the office with increasing frequency. "Are you ready?" Lucia asked as I sat down. "I've been ready for 3 years," I replied. The conference room had the understated elegance of old money: substantial furniture, subtle art, nothing ostentatious. It was the kind of space that conveyed authority without needing to announce. It did the opposite of Clayton's preferred aesthetic. Stanley opened a leather portfolio. "Clayton's filing is aggressive, but predictable. He's claiming that Meridian is his separate property since he's been the face of the company and taken on the CEO title for the past 4 years. He's also offering what looks like a generous settlement," Erica added. "But it's actually about 20% of what you're entitled to." The settlement offer was classic Clayton, appearing magnanimous while actually being self-serving. The same approach he took with difficult clients, offering terms that seemed favorable on the surface, but contained hidden advantages for Meridian. Lucia slid a document across the table. This is our response. I reviewed the pages, which outlined in precise detail the current ownership structure of Meridian Consulting. 62% owned by Northstar Holdings, my separate LLC established 3 years ago, 31% owned by Clayton directly, and 7% distributed among key employees. When did this change? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It didn't, Lucia explained. This has been the ownership structure for the past 5 years. Clayton signed off on the restructuring himself during the second round of expansion funding. He was so focused on getting the capital that he barely reviewed the organizational documents. He always did skim the boring details, I said, remembering. How often Clayton had signed whatever I put in front of him when it came to administrative matters. It had been a consistent pattern throughout our business relationship. Clayton focused on what he considered the big picture: client acquisition, market positioning, brand development. The details of operational infrastructure, financial modeling, and governance protocols he delegated to me, often with an impatient wave of his hand. His signature is on every page, Lucia confirmed, and we have video recording of the signing meeting. Video documentation had been Erica's suggestion, a precaution that had seemed excessive at the time but now proved invaluable. Clayton couldn't claim he'd been misled or that documents had been altered after signing. Stanley leaned forward. We've prepared a comprehensive response to his filing. It outlines the actual ownership structure, documents his systematic violation of company protocols, and includes evidence of his personal indiscretions. Stella? I asked. Erica nodded. And 2 others before her. All documented, along with company resources he diverted to entertain them. This was unexpected information. I'd only known about Stella. The revelation that there had been others was both surprising and yet somehow not. Clayton had always cultivated a network of admiring professional women, maintaining what he called strategic relationships across the industry. What happens next? I asked. We file our response, Stanley explained. Then, we request an emergency hearing regarding the business operations since he's already taken steps to lock you out of systems and accounts. Stanley had anticipated Clayton's moves with remarkable accuracy. Within hours of sending the divorce papers, Clayton had indeed begun restricting my access to company systems, changes that would have been devastating had I not established secondary access protocols as part of Protocol Winter. And then? Pressed, Lucia's expression was determined. Then we watch his face when he realizes who really owns the company he's been claiming as his exclusive achievement. I thought about Clayton's laugh on the phone that morning. Time for an upgrade, he'd said. Indeed it was, just not the one he had planned. As I left the meeting, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard the news? Coffee sometime? Stella. I deleted the message without responding. Stella. Reynolds was about to discover that her alliance with Clayton had been built on a foundation far less solid than she'd believed. Their plans for after she's gone would never materialize, but that wasn't my concern. My focus remained on Meridian, the company that represented 15 years of my life and the livelihoods of 68 families. Clayton had tried to position this as a personal matter, a simple divorce followed by his continued leadership of his company. He was about to discover how profoundly he had miscalculated. My car was waiting in the parking garage below the Hamilton building. As I drove towards the Meridian offices, I felt a curious sense of calm. The anxiety of waiting, of maintaining the facade while preparing for this moment, had lifted. Now there was only the clarity of purpose, the strategic execution of a plan 3 years in the making. Clayton had taught me many things over 15 years, but perhaps the most valuable was this. In business, as in chess, the winner isn't the one who makes the boldest moves, but the one who thinks several moves ahead. I had been thinking ahead for 3 years. Tomorrow would reveal just how thoroughly I had outmaneuvered him at his own game. The next morning, I dressed with particular care, a tailored charcoal suit that Clayton had never seen before. I'd purchased it 3 months ago and kept it in the secure storage unit with other preparations. The suit projected exactly what I needed: confidence, professionalism, and a silent statement that I was not the same woman he thought he knew. The fabric was Italian wool, structured but not severe. I paired it with a deep blue blouse that brought out the intensity in my eyes, a subtle psychological advantage I'd learned from watching Clayton in countless negotiations. Appearance matters, especially on days when everything is at stake. As I applied my makeup with practiced precision, I thought about the woman in the mirror. 3 years ago, the discovery of Clayton's betrayal might have shattered me. Today, it had simply revealed what I'd secretly suspected: that the partnership I thought we had, in marriage and in business, had been a carefully constructed illusion. My phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. "Everyone's in position. Cooper is prepared. All systems secure." Cooper Miller, our chief financial officer, had been brought into Protocol Winter 6 months earlier, when financial irregularities became impossible to ignore. His loyalty to Meridian, rather than to Clayton personally, had made him a crucial ally. As head of our financial systems, his cooperation ensured that Clayton couldn't simply drain accounts or manipulate records in the coming confrontation. Arriving at Meridian's offices, I was greeted by the confused expression of the receptionist, John, who had clearly been told something about my status. "Mrs. Brooks, I wasn't expecting you today." The young man's discomfort was evident. John had been with us for only 8 months, hired during a period when Clayton had begun making more unilateral personnel decisions. "It's still Ms. Harlow professionally, John," I reminded him gently. I'd kept my maiden name for business, something that had irritated Clayton over the years. "Is everyone in the executive conference room for the 9 o'clock? It had been a deliberate choice when we'd married, keeping my professional identity separate from our personal relationship. Clayton had initially supported it as a modern approach, but as years passed, he'd begun introducing me as Mrs. Brooks in business settings with increasing frequency. "Yes, but Mr. Brooks mentioned you wouldn't be— that is, he said you were taking some time off." John's nervousness was understandable. Being caught between contradicting executives was an uncomfortable position for any employee, especially one as new as he was. I smiled reassuringly. How thoughtful of him to be concerned about my schedule. I'll head in. The central hallway of Meridian's headquarters stretched before me, sleek and modern with glass-walled offices lining both sides. Employees glanced up as I passed, their expressions ranging from surprise to relief to concern. News traveled fast in any organization, and Clayton had clearly been setting the stage for my departure. As I approached the conference room, I could hear Clayton's voice through the door. He was using his visionary tone, the one he reserved for announcing major company directions. The confident, slightly theatrical cadence that had won over countless clients and investors over the years. Exciting transition period. Stella will be stepping into the expanded role of Chief Operations Officer, overseeing client relationships and internal processes. I paused outside the door, taking a final steadying breath. This moment represented the culmination of 3 years of preparation, of careful documentation and strategic patience. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just my future, but Meridian's. The weight of responsibility for our 68 employees, for the clients who trusted us, for the legacy we'd built. All of it rested on how well I handled the next steps. Clayton was counting on my emotional reaction, expecting either an undignified confrontation or a defeated retreat. He would get neither. I pushed open the door, and the room fell silent. 12 faces turned toward me. Our executive team, plus Stella, who was standing beside Clayton at the head of the table. Her hand rested casually on his shoulder in a proprietary gesture that confirmed everything. The executive conference room had been redesigned the previous year. Clayton's project, with its dramatic lighting and oversized table that positioned him as the clear focal point. The space had been engineered for exactly this type of moment, allowing him to command attention and project authority. Today, it would serve a very different purpose. Clayton recovered quickly, his expression shifting from shock to controlled annoyance. His ability to mask reactions had always been impressive, a skill honed through years of high-stakes negotiations. "Nikki, this is surprising. I thought we agreed you'd take some time for yourself." His voice carried just the right note of concerned authority, the tone he used when gently correcting a client's misunderstanding. To anyone who didn't know better, he would have sounded perfectly reasonable. "We agreed no such thing," I replied calmly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. "Please continue. I believe you were announcing organizational changes." I set my portfolio on the table with deliberate care. The leather-bound case contained everything I needed for what was about to unfold: documents, evidence, and the culmination of Protocol Winter's meticulous preparation. Stella's hand dropped from his shoulder. She wore a cream-colored dress that matched Clayton's tie, a coordinated visual statement of their alliance. The subtle color coordination wasn't accidental. It was typical of Clayton's attention to optics, his belief that perception shaped reality. I noticed several executives exchanging uncomfortable glances. Cooper maintained a neutral expression, though a slight nod acknowledged my arrival. The others looked varying degrees of confused or concerned. Clearly, they'd been hearing Clayton's version of events. Clayton forced a smile. "As I was saying, we're implementing some structural changes to streamline operations. I've asked our legal team to prepare the necessary documentation, which we'll review later this week." By legal team, he meant the outside counsel he'd recently engaged without board approval, another governance violation we documented. Meridian's official legal counsel remained Lucia Martinez and her firm, despite Clayton's attempts to marginalize their role. Cooper Miller cleared his throat. "I haven't received any financial projections for these changes." Cooper had always been meticulous about numbers, one of the reasons I'd brought him on 5 years ago despite Clayton's preference for a different candidate. Clayton had wanted to hire an old business school colleague, someone more aligned with our vision, as he'd put it. I had insisted on Cooper, impressed by his rigorous approach and ethical reputation. It had been one of the few hiring battles I'd won outright in recent years. "They're forthcoming," Clayton replied dismissively. "For now, I wanted to share the vision." Vision had become Clayton's favorite word in recent years, a convenient shield against questions about implementation details or financial viability. Under his framing, anyone asking practical questions was positioned as lacking imagination or boldness. I opened my portfolio. Perhaps this would be a good time to address some governance questions that have recently emerged. The phrase governance questions sent a visible ripple through the room. In corporate settings, few terms carry quite the same weight, suggesting as they do potential regulatory issues or board concerns. Clayton's jaw tightened. "This isn't the appropriate forum, Nikki. We can discuss personal matters privately." This was his first attempt to reframe the situation, positioning any concerns I might raise as personal matters rather than legitimate business issues. It was a tactic he'd used increasingly over the years, suggesting that my professional objections were emotionally motivated. "This isn't about personal matters," I clarified. "This is about corporate governance and accurate information for our executive team." I removed several document copies from my portfolio and passed them around the table. "These are the current ownership and governance structures of Meridian Consulting." The folders contained comprehensive documentation of Meridian's actual legal structure, not the version Clayton had been presenting to the executive team. Each folder included the official corporate organizational charts, ownership percentages, and decision authority matrices that had been in place for the past 5 years. Clayton stood. "This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene once I've had a chance to speak with Ms. Harlow. His attempt to reassert control was predictable. When faced with unexpected challenges, Clayton's first instinct was always to shut down the conversation, regroup privately, and then re-emerge with a revised narrative. Actually, I continued as if he hadn't spoken, as majority shareholder through North Star Holdings, I'm exercising my right to continue this meeting. I glanced at our confused executives. If you'll review page 3, you'll see the current ownership structure, which has been in place for the past 5 years. The room went deadly quiet as everyone turned to the indicated page. The silence was broken only by the sound of paper shuffling as our leadership team absorbed information that directly contradicted what many of them had believed about Meridian's structure. Clayton snatched a copy from the table, his face darkening as he scanned the document. The color drained from his face as he processed what he was seeing. His 31% ownership stake laid out in clear contrast to North Star Holdings' 62%. "This is fabricated," he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the response I'd anticipated. Clayton's default when confronted with inconvenient facts was to dismiss them outright, buying time while he formulated a more nuanced strategy. I held his gaze. "Your signature appears on pages 4, 7, and 12. The corporate seal and notarization appear on page 15. You'll find nothing fabricated in this document, Clayton." Around the table, our executives were reviewing the material with expressions ranging from shock to dawning comprehension. The realization that Meridian's ownership structure was fundamentally different from what Clayton had represented was settling in. Stella looked between us, her confident expression faltering. "Clayton, what is this?" She had positioned herself, physically at his side throughout the meeting, a visual embodiment of their alliance. Now, the uncertainty in her voice betrayed the first cracks in that united front. He ignored her, flipping through the pages with increasing agitation. "This was for the expansion funding. You told me this was standard restructuring to secure the capital." And it was, I agreed. A restructuring that placed majority ownership with North Star Holdings, which, as page 6 clearly indicates, is solely owned by me. Cooper studied his copy with the focused attention of a financial professional who understood exactly what he was seeing. As CFO, he would recognize the legitimacy of the documents instantly, the proper legal format, the consistent dating of amendments, the sequence of board approvals. These appear to be the same organizational documents in our corporate records. I've referenced them for audits several times. Cooper's confirmation was the turning point. As CFO, his acknowledgement of the document's legitimacy carried weight with the rest of the executive team. Clayton could dismiss my claims, but Cooper's professional verification was harder to ignore. Clayton dropped the papers. "This meeting is over. Everyone out except Nikki." His voice had taken on the edge that typically preceded his rare but intense displays of temper. Throughout our marriage and partnership, I'd observed that Clayton reserved true anger for moments when he felt his control slipping. No one moved. "Actually," I said quietly, "as majority shareholder, I'm calling for an emergency board meeting, effective immediately. Only board members need to stay." I looked around the table. That would be myself, Clayton, Cooper as CFO, and Lucia Martinez, who should be arriving momentarily. As if on cue, the door opened, and Lucia entered, accompanied by 2 people I recognized as partners from her firm. Her timing was perfect. We had coordinated her arrival to coincide with this moment, understanding the psychological impact it would have. "Perfect timing," I noted. "The board is convening to address some governance concerns." Lucia's presence changed the dynamic instantly. As Meridian's long-standing corporate counsel, her arrival with colleagues signaled the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't a marital dispute spilling into the workplace. It was a formal governance review with legal oversight. The non-board executives filed out, casting uncertain glances between Clayton and me. Stella hesitated, clearly reluctant to be excluded. "You should go," Clayton told her stiffly. But I'm being appointed COO, she protested. Her objection revealed more than she perhaps intended, confirming that she had indeed been promised a position of authority within Meridian, despite having no formal qualifications for the role beyond her. Relationship with Clayton? That appointment has not been approved by the board, I pointed out, and would require a majority vote. After everyone except the board members and legal representatives had left, Clayton leaned forward, his knuckles white against the polished conference table. The veneer of professional composure had cracked, revealing the rage beneath. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he hissed. I recognized this version of Clayton, the one that emerged when his carefully constructed plans encountered unexpected resistance. His charm and confidence receded, replaced by a cold anger that had become increasingly common in our private interactions over recent years. "Ensuring proper corporate governance," I replied. "Something that has been increasingly overlooked in recent months." Lucia placed a thick folder on the table. "We've prepared a complete report of governance violations that require immediate board attention. These include unauthorized personnel changes, unapproved financial transactions, and potential misappropriation of corporate resources." The folder contained months of meticulously documented evidence, emails, financial records, contract alterations, all revealing a pattern of Clayton circumventing established protocols and decision processes. Cooper adjusted his glasses, professional as always despite the tension. "I've noted several financial irregularities myself in recent quarters. I assumed they were approved through channels I wasn't privy to." Cooper's admission was significant. As CFO, his acknowledgement of financial irregularities carried substantial weight. It confirmed that Clayton's actions weren't merely procedural shortcuts but potentially serious governance failures. "They weren't approved at all," I explained. "Clayton has been operating as if Meridian were his sole proprietorship, rather than a corporation with established governance requirements." Clayton's face had transformed from anger to something closer to calculation. I recognized the expression. He was assessing options, looking for leverage. It was the same expression he wore during difficult negotiations when searching for an unexpected angle. "This is absurd," he finally said. "I built this company. Everyone knows that." His appeal to the widely accepted narrative was predictable. Clayton had spent years cultivating the perception of himself as Meridian's visionary founder, subtly diminishing my role in public settings until many in the industry genuinely believed he was the primary or even sole creator of our success. "We built it together," I corrected. "And then you decided it should be yours alone. When exactly were you planning to inform me that you'd sold our Denver office to finance your new venture with Stella?" The Denver office had been particularly meaningful to me. I'd led its establishment 3 years earlier, cultivating a specialized team that had become one of our most profitable divisions. Its sale represented not just a business decision, but a personal affront. His eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected me to know about that. The sale had been conducted with unusual secrecy, routed through a subsidiary to obscure the transaction, from routine financial reviews. Without Protocol Winter's enhanced monitoring systems, the diversion might have gone undetected until too late. "The board never approved that sale," Cooper noted, his expression hardening. "That would require full board approval and formal documentation." Cooper's reaction confirmed what I already knew. Clayton had bypassed not just my authority but proper governance channels entirely, a significant violation of his fiduciary duties. "The documentation is being prepared," Clayton maintained, but his confident facade was cracking. Lucia opened her folder. "We have evidence that the sale was completed last week. The proceeds were directed to Summit Partners LLC, a recently formed entity with no formal connection to Meridian." She slid a bank statement across the table. "An entity where Ms. Reynolds is listed as co-owner." The bank statement was particularly damning, showing the transfer of funds from the Denver office sale directly to the new company Clayton had established with Stella. It wasn't merely a governance violation but potential misappropriation of corporate assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Clayton's expression cycled through several emotions: shock that we had discovered the transaction, anger at being exposed, and finally, a calculated assessment of his remaining options. "You always were too focused on details," Clayton finally said, attempting a dismissive tone that fell flat. "This is just business. Companies restructure all the time." His attempt to minimize the severity of the situation was transparent. By framing serious governance violations as routine business decisions, he was trying to regain control of the narrative, a tactic that had served him well in the past but was failing him now. "Indeed they do," I agreed. "Which is why the board will now vote on a restructuring of our own." The moment hung between us. 15 years of partnership balanced on the edge of irrevocable change. In Clayton's eyes, I could see the gradual realization that his carefully constructed plans were collapsing, that the wife he had dismissed as a mere supporting player had orchestrated a counter-strategy he never anticipated. "You can't do this," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "I'm not doing anything," I replied. "The board is addressing governance violations that threaten the company's integrity. As directors, that's our fiduciary responsibility." Clayton looked to Cooper, perhaps hoping to find an ally or at least a neutral party. Instead, he found the steady gaze of a financial professional confronted with clear evidence of impropriety. "The records speak for themselves," Cooper said quietly. "These transactions were deliberately concealed from standard financial reporting." Clayton's isolation in that moment was complete. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in, that the company he had increasingly claimed as his personal domain had never actually been his to control. "Shall we proceed to the vote?" Lucia asked, professional as always despite the charged atmosphere. Clayton stared at the documents spread across the table, evidence of his systematic attempts to claim Meridian as his own, to erase my contribution, to build a new future with Stella using resources that weren't his to take. "This isn't over," he said, the words carrying both threat and recognition that, for today at least, he had lost. "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning." The confrontation I had prepared for during 3 long years had finally arrived. Clayton had expected to dictate terms from a position of strength, confident in his control of Meridian and his ability to push me aside. Instead, he found himself facing the consequences of his own actions, exposed by the very attention to detail he had always dismissed. Protocol Winter had emerged from dormancy, revealing that beneath the surface, preparations for this moment had been advancing all along. The emergency board meeting lasted 4 hours. Clayton alternated between defensive posturing, thinly veiled, threats, and eventually, desperate negotiation. Through it all, I maintained the calm demeanor I'd practiced for 3 years, letting Lucia present the evidence methodically while Cooper provided financial context for each violation. The boardroom, once Clayton's domain of authority, had transformed into the venue of his undoing. Large windows overlooked the city skyline, a view he had often used as a backdrop for important client meetings, positioning himself against the vista of success. Today, that same view served as silent witness to his professional unraveling. "Let's begin with the Denver office transaction," Lucia said, her tone measured as she opened a comprehensive file. On April 12th, Meridian Denver Holdings was transferred to Apex Acquisitions for $2.4 million, significantly below market value. Apex then immediately transferred ownership to Summit Partners, LLC. The transaction trail was displayed on the conference room screen, a damning sequence of shell companies and redirected funds that Cooper narrated with clinical precision. "Apex Acquisitions appears to be a shell company," he explained, highlighting key details in the financial records. "It existed for precisely 4 days, long enough to serve as an intermediary in the Denver office transfer." Clayton shifted in his chair, the Italian leather no longer seeming to offer the comfort it once did. This was a strategic divestment. Denver wasn't performing to expectations. That's interesting, I commented, considering Denver's Q1 revenue exceeded targets by 22%. Their client retention rate is the highest in the company. The Denver office had been one of our most successful expansions, a point of particular pride for me. I had personally recruited the team lead, developed their service model, and nurtured their client relationships. Clayton knew exactly what the office meant to me, which perhaps explained why he had targeted it first. These unauthorized transfers to Summit Partners totaled $2.7 million over the past 6 months, Cooper explained, highlighting a spreadsheet projection. That's approximately the value of the Denver office that was sold without board approval. Cooper's presentation was devastating in its thoroughness. Each transaction was documented with timestamps, authorization codes, and the digital trail that linked the activities directly to Clayton's credentials. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. Clayton's attorney, who had arrived an hour into the meeting looking harried and unprepared, leaned over to whisper something in his ear. The attorney, Benjamin Reynolds from a mid-tier firm, was clearly out of his depth. His expertise appeared to be in divorce proceedings, not complex corporate governance matters. My client was operating under the understanding that as CEO, he had operational discretion, the attorney offered weakly. It was a desperate attempt to reframe Clayton's actions as reasonable business decisions rather than governance violations. The argument might have influenced an uninformed audience, but it fell flat before the financial and legal professionals assembled in the boardroom. Lucia smiled thinly. Operational discretion does not extend to selling corporate assets or diverting proceeds to personal ventures. The corporate bylaws are quite clear on matters requiring board approval. She turned to a specific section of the documentation, highlighting the relevant passages with practiced efficiency. Section 7.3 explicitly requires board approval for any asset disposition exceeding $250,000 in value. Section 12.1 prohibits related party transactions without full disclosure and recusal from voting. Clayton's attorney shifted uncomfortably. My client reserves the right to dispute these interpretations. Of course, Lucia agreed. That's his prerogative. However, the documentary evidence is substantial, and I've taken the liberty of consulting with 3 independent corporate governance experts who have provided written opinions supporting our position. This was a component of Protocol Winter I hadn't been aware of. Lucia had gone beyond our preparations to secure external validation, further strengthening our position. Her thoroughness reminded me why I had trusted her as our corporate counsel, despite Clayton's attempts to marginalize her role. The meeting progressed through a comprehensive review of Clayton's governance violations, unauthorized personnel changes, undisclosed conflicts of interest, manipulation of financial reporting to obscure certain transactions. Each allegation was supported by meticulous documentation, presented in a sequence that revealed not isolated incidents, but a systematic pattern of misconduct. By early afternoon, the boardroom atmosphere had shifted from confrontational to something closer to a methodical dismantling. Each piece of evidence further eroded Clayton's position until the final vote was merely a formality. Through it all, I watched Clayton's expressions cycle through familiar patterns, the confidence that had initially dismissed the allegations, giving way to defensive arguments, then to anger as those arguments failed, and finally to a calculating assessment of his diminishing options. The board resolves to remove Clayton Brooks as CEO of Meridian Consulting, effective immediately, I stated for the record as Cooper seconded the motion. Further, all transactions conducted without proper board approval within the last 12 months will be subject to comprehensive review and potential legal action for recovery of assets. The vote was taken formally, with Cooper and I constituting the majority. Clayton abstained rather than voting against, perhaps a final strategic decision, avoiding the creation of a record that showed explicit opposition to proper governance. Clayton's face had lost the confident glow I'd grown so familiar with over 15 years. He looked older suddenly, his carefully maintained image of success crumbling visibly. The man who had entered the boardroom as CEO, certain of his authority and position, would leave as a removed executive with no operational role. "You've been planning this for years," he said quietly, as the others gathered their materials. It wasn't quite an accusation, more an acknowledgement tinged with something like reluctant respect. In that moment, I saw a flicker of the man I had first partnered with, the one who could recognize and appreciate strategic thinking even when it worked against him. "I've been protecting what we built," I corrected. "You've been planning its dismantling for years." That distinction mattered to me. My actions hadn't been about revenge or even self-preservation alone. They had been about protecting Meridian, the company, the employees, the clients, the legacy we had built together before Clayton decided it should be his alone. As we exited the boardroom, the tension in the office was palpable. Employees watched through glass walls, pretending to work, while absorbing the corporate drama unfolding before them. The floor was unusually quiet. Conversations hushed, phone calls taken in lowered voices, everyone sensing that significant changes were occurring. Stella waited in the adjacent meeting room, pacing nervously. Her cream-colored dress, so carefully coordinated with Clayton's tie that morning, now seemed like a costume from a production that had been unexpectedly canceled. When she saw Clayton's expression, her own composure fractured. "What happened?" she demanded, looking between us. The woman who had been positioned to become Meridian's new COO just hours earlier now stood uncertain of her status. Her planned ascension abruptly derailed. Her relationship with Clayton had been built on a foundation of shared ambition and anticipated power, both now crumbling before her. Clayton brushed past her without answering. His silence spoke volumes. The man who always had words, explanations, narratives to shape any situation, found himself wordless in the face of complete reversal. I paused, considering the woman who had been both my colleague and my husband's mistress. Stella Reynolds had been hired 3 years ago as Director of Client Relations, a role she had performed competently, if not exceptionally. Her greater talent had been in understanding and aligning herself with power, a skill she had deployed effectively with Clayton. "The board has voted to remove Clayton as CEO," I explained professionally, "and is reviewing all unauthorized transactions, including your appointment and the formation of Summit Partners." My tone remained neutral. This wasn't personal vindictiveness, but corporate governance. The distinction mattered, both legally and ethically. Whatever personal feelings I might have harbored toward Stella were irrelevant to the professional consequences of her actions. Her eyes widened. "That's our company. Clayton said everything was arranged." The genuine shock in her expression was revealing. Clayton had clearly presented their plans as more advanced and secure than they actually were. He had promised her not just a relationship, but a professional position and ownership stake, commitments he had never been authorized to make. "I'm sure he did," I replied without rancor. "You might want to consult your own attorney. The board will be in touch regarding your continued employment at Meridian." I wasn't being cruel, merely factual. Stella's participation in unauthorized transactions and conflicts of interest would need to be addressed. Whether that resulted in termination, legal action, or some form of settlement would depend on the full investigation now underway. I left her standing there, caught in the aftermath of Clayton's failed coup, not out of cruelty, but because there were more pressing matters to address. The company needed stabilization after the shock of leadership change. The hallway outside felt different now. The sleek, modern design that had always reflected Clayton's aesthetic preferences suddenly seemed like a space in transition, awaiting new definition. Employees watched me pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, what appeared to be cautious relief. In my office, which, thankfully, Clayton hadn't yet reassigned, I found Erica waiting with a comprehensive transition plan already prepared. We had anticipated this day coming, though not necessarily triggered by divorce papers on my anniversary. My office had always been functional rather than showy, focused on effectiveness rather than impression. The contrast with Clayton's larger, more dramatic space had reflected our different approaches to leadership. Now that separation of styles would become more significant as I assumed full control of Meridian's direction. The executive team is understandably concerned, Erica reported. Cooper is talking to them individually, but they need to hear from you directly. Erica's calm efficiency was exactly what the situation required. While I had been in the boardroom, overseeing Clayton's removal, she had been activating the next phase of our contingency plans, preparing communications, securing systems, and developing the transition strategy that would carry Meridian through the coming days. I nodded, reviewing the communication strategy we'd developed. Schedule an all-hands meeting for tomorrow morning. For today, I'll meet with department heads to reassure them about operational continuity. The transition plan was comprehensive, covering everything from immediate security protocols to long-term strategic repositioning. We had developed it methodically over the past year, refining it as Clayton's behavior became increasingly concerning. And Clayton's access? She asked. Already restricted, I confirmed. IT implemented the contingency protocol as soon as the board vote was recorded. Protocol Winter had included detailed technical preparations, secondary authentication systems, backup access protocols, and carefully documented chains of command that could be activated when necessary. Clayton had always dismissed cybersecurity as excessive overhead, another detail he'd considered beneath his attention. Marcus Chen, our security director, had been instrumental in developing these protections. Initially hired to enhance client data security, his role had expanded to include safeguarding Meridian's internal systems from precisely the kind of threat Clayton now posed, an authorized insider with motivation to cause harm. Marcus reports, "All critical systems are secure," Erica added. Clayton's credentials were revoked at 2:17 p.m., immediately following the board vote. The backup authentication systems are functioning as designed. This was particularly gratifying. Clayton had never understood why I had insisted on redundant security systems, multiple authorization layers, and regular penetration testing. He had viewed these measures as bureaucratic obstacles rather than essential protections. "What about the client accounts?" I asked. No unusual activity detected. Cooper has prepared a client communication strategy, prioritized by relationship value and sensitivity. We can begin outreach this afternoon. Client relationships represented Meridian's most valuable asset, the foundation of our revenue and reputation. Protecting them during this transition was paramount. Clayton had cultivated personal relationships with many key clients, positioning himself as their primary contact despite the teams of consultants who actually delivered services. "Start with the top 10, I instructed. "I'll handle Knox, Westfield, and Beaumont personally. These three represented our oldest and most valuable client relationships. I had maintained connections with them despite Clayton's attempts to position himself as their exclusive contact, ensuring they recognized Meridian's value beyond his personal charm. By evening, I had met with every department head, conducted calls with our three largest clients to ensure continuity, and signed emergency authorizations to freeze the questionable transactions Clayton had initiated. The company would be stabilized by morning, though the legal ramifications would take months to fully resolve. The day had been exhausting but clarifying. The constant vigilance of the past 3 years, maintaining the facade of normalcy while documenting betrayal, had given way to open action. There was something liberating about finally operating without pretense, addressing the governance issues directly, rather than monitoring them from the shadows. I was gathering my things to leave when my office door opened. Clayton stood there, looking disheveled in a way I'd never seen before. His tie was loosened, his usual perfect hair slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. This was a version of Clayton I had rarely seen. The carefully maintained, image fraying at the edges, the performance of perfect control giving way to genuine reaction. In 15 years together, I had glimpsed this unguarded Clayton perhaps a handful of times, usually during moments of extreme stress or rare vulnerability. "We need to talk," he said, his voice lacking its usual command. "I think our attorneys should handle communications going forward," I replied, continuing to organize documents into my portfolio. This wasn't pettiness, but prudence. With potential legal actions pending regarding Clayton's governance violations, direct communication created risks for both of us. Better to maintain professional distance and let legal representatives manage necessary interactions. "Cut the corporate speak, Nikki," he snapped, showing a flash of the anger that must have been simmering all day. 15 years together, and you've been planning this behind my back the whole time. His characterization was revealing. Positioning my defensive preparations as equivalent to his deliberate betrayal. In Clayton's worldview, my protection of myself and the company was apparently comparable to his affair and attempted appropriation. I looked up at him then, really looked at the man I'd built a life with, the handsome features that had first attracted me across a crowded networking event, the confident posture that had carried him through countless presentations and negotiations, the expressive eyes that could convey charm or calculation depending on his purpose, all familiar, yet now seeming to belong to someone I never truly knew. 3 years, I corrected. I've been preparing for this possibility for 3 years, since I found your messages with Stella on our 12th anniversary. His expression shifted from anger to momentary surprise, then back to indignation. The revelation that I had discovered his affair so long ago and said nothing clearly caught him off guard. He had thought himself more careful, his betrayal better concealed. So this is revenge? For an affair? The simplification was classic Clayton, reducing complex situations to simplistic narratives that positioned him as victim rather than instigator. Throughout our marriage and partnership, he had consistently reframed conflicts to minimize his responsibility and emphasize external factors. "This is protection," I countered, "for a company that supports 68 families, for clients who trust us with their businesses, for my own financial security that you were planning to dismantle." My motivation mattered to me, not for Clayton's understanding, but for my own integrity. I hadn't acted from wounded pride or vengeful impulse, but from considered assessment of threat and responsibility. The distinction was fundamental to who I was and how I had approached this entire situation. "I was going to give you a fair settlement," he protested. The indignation in his voice suggested he genuinely believed this, that his offer of 20% of what I was legally entitled to constituted generosity rather than exploitation. It was a revealing glimpse into his perspective, how thoroughly he had convinced himself of his own narrative. 20% of what I was entitled to is not fair, I said. And nothing about serving me with divorce papers on our anniversary suggests you were concerned with fairness. The anniversary timing had been deliberate, I was certain. Clayton appreciated symbolic gestures, the poetry of significant dates. Ending our marriage on the same day it had legally begun would have appealed to his sense of narrative symmetry. That the date also held genuine emotional significance for me would have been, at best, a secondary consideration. He paced the office, the reality of his situation finally seeming to sink in. The controlled executive who had commanded authority hours earlier had given way to someone closer to desperation. His movements were uncharacteristically agitated, lacking the deliberate grace he typically projected. "What do you want? Half the company? You can have it. We can work something out." This offer, made in haste and obvious desperation, revealed how completely Clayton had failed to understand the situation. He was still operating as if he had leverage, as if ownership of Meridian was his to bestow rather than something I had already secured. I shook my head. Clayton, I already own 62%. The board has voted to remove you as CEO. The Denver office sale is being unwound. There's nothing to work out beyond what our attorneys will negotiate regarding the divorce. My statement of these simple facts seemed to impact him more profoundly than the hours of documentation and evidence presented in the boardroom. Perhaps because now, alone with me, he could no longer maintain the performance of control he displayed in professional settings. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice hollow. The accusation was revealing, positioning me as the destroyer rather than the protector, himself as victim rather than instigator. Throughout our relationship, Clayton had demonstrated this capacity for narrative inversion, recasting situations to maintain his preferred self-image regardless of actual circumstances. "No," I replied quietly. "I've preserved what we built from your attempt to destroy it. There's a difference." This wasn't semantic quibbling, but a fundamental distinction. Clayton had initiated the sequence of betrayals, the affair with Stella, the secret diversion of company resources, the planned replacement of me in both marriage and business. My actions had been defensive rather than destructive, preserving rather than dismantling. As he turned to leave, shoulders slumped in defeat, I found myself asking the question that had lingered for 3 years. Why, Clayton? We built something remarkable together. What made you decide it should be just yours? The question emerged, from a place of genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Despite everything, I still wanted to understand the thinking that had led us here, how the partnership that had once seemed so promising had deteriorated into secret plans and counter-strategies. He paused at the door, not turning around. The set of his shoulders spoke of resignation, perhaps even a fleeting moment of honest reflection. "You were always so thorough, so focused on details and procedures. I wanted to do things my way without justifying every decision. With Stella, I could be the visionary without all the constraints." The irony was almost painful. The very thoroughness he'd resented had been what protected the company from his impulsive decisions. The attention to detail he'd dismissed had documented every violation that led to today's outcome. The constraints he chafed against had been the governance structures that ensured Meridian's stability and integrity. I thought about Stella, about the version of himself Clayton had presented to her, the visionary unbound by tedious process, the bold leader constrained only by his pragmatic but unimaginative partner. It was a narrative that would have appealed to both their egos, casting their affair not merely as personal attraction, but as the natural alliance of like-minded innovators. "Goodbye, Clayton," I said, turning back to my work. There was still much to do. He lingered a moment longer, perhaps waiting for something more. Anger, tears, some emotional display that would confirm his narrative of me as the emotional counterpart to his rational leadership. When nothing came, he left without another word, the soft click of the door closing behind him. After he left, I sat alone in my office as twilight settled over the city. Not in celebration or even satisfaction, but in quiet acknowledgement of an ending and a beginning. Tomorrow would bring challenges, reassuring the team, stabilizing client relationships, addressing the financial irregularities Clayton had created. My phone buzzed with messages. Cooper confirming security protocols were holding, Lucia updating, me on legal filings, Erica finalizing the morning's all-hands agenda. The team that had helped implement Protocol Winter was transitioning seamlessly to recovery operations. I moved to the window, looking out over the city lights beginning to flicker on against the darkening sky. The view from my office had always been less dramatic than Clayton's corner suite, but I had preferred it. Oriented toward the older part of the city with its mix of historic architecture and modern additions, complex and layered rather than simplistically impressive. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the day. The anniversary that had begun with divorce papers had ended with reclamation. Not just of the company we'd built, but of my own narrative, my role in Meridian's creation and growth, my contributions that Clayton had increasingly erased from the company's public story. There was grief there, certainly, not just for the marriage that had ended long before today's divorce filing, but for the partnership that had once held such promise. Clayton and I had been genuinely complementary. Once, his vision and charisma balanced by my thoroughness and implementation skills. We had accomplished together what neither could have achieved alone. That synergy had been real, at least for a time, before Clayton began to resent the very qualities that made our partnership effective. Before he decided that my contribution was dispensable, my role an impediment to his unfettered vision rather than the foundation that made vision achievable. My reflection in the window glass looked back at me, composed, professional, resolute. Not the broken ex-wife Clayton might have expected today, but the executive who had protected what we built from his attempt to claim it exclusively as his own. Clayton had wanted an upgrade. He got one, just not the one he expected. The next morning arrived with crystalline clarity, both in the sharp autumn sunlight streaming through my condo windows and in my own sense of purpose. The constant vigilance of the past 3 years had lifted, replaced by the straightforward challenges of rebuilding and reinforcing what Clayton had tried to dismantle. I dressed with careful intention, a deep blue suit that conveyed authority, without aggression, professional yet approachable. Today's all-hands meeting would set the tone for Meridian's path forward. The employees deserved transparency about the leadership changes and confidence in the company's stability. As I applied my makeup with practiced efficiency, I considered the woman in the mirror. 3 years of maintaining appearances while preparing for yesterday's confrontation had taken a toll I was only now beginning to recognize. The constant compartmentalization, wife, business partner, secret strategist, had required a fragmentation of self that could now begin to heal. My phone chimed with a text from Cooper. Office secure. Clayton attempted remote access at 5:43 a.m., blocked by security protocols. The early hour of the attempt was telling. Clayton working before dawn, perhaps hoping to retrieve files or alter records while he assumed the office was empty. The predictability of the move validated our security preparations, the layered protections Marcus had implemented specifically to counter insider threats. I arrived at the office 30 minutes before the all-hands meeting, giving myself time to review the presentation with Erica and meet briefly with the executive team. The mood was tense but focused. These leaders understood that their composure would set the tone for their departments. Be direct but not dramatic, I advised the assembled executives. This is a governance correction, not a crisis. Meridian's fundamentals remain strong. The framing mattered. How we communicated these changes would determine whether employees saw them as catastrophic upheaval or necessary realignment. Our goal was to maintain operational continuity while implementing improved governance. The central conference room, the largest in our office, was filled to capacity by 9 o'clock. Extra chairs had been brought in, with some employees standing along the walls. 68 people whose professional lives were directly affected by the leadership changes now looked to me for explanation and reassurance. I stood at the front, feeling the weight of their collective attention. Clayton had always relished these moments in the spotlight, drawing energy from audience focus. I approached them differently, not as performance opportunities, but as communication responsibilities, chances to provide the clarity people needed to perform their roles effectively. Good morning, I began. As most of you have heard by now, there have been significant changes in Meridian's leadership structure. The board has voted to remove Clayton Brooks as CEO, effective immediately. The directness of the statement sent a ripple through the room. Murmurs, glances exchanged, slight shifts in posture as people absorbed the confirmation of rumors that had been circulating since yesterday afternoon. I want to be clear about 3 things, I continued. First, Meridian Consulting is financially sound. The changes in Leadership will not affect our operational stability or client relationships. Second, there will be a review of certain decisions and transactions made in recent months. This is standard procedure during any leadership transition and ensures proper corporate governance. Third, your jobs are secure. The company is not changing direction or reducing staff. In fact, we anticipate growth as we refocus on our core strengths. These 3 points address the primary concerns any employee would have during leadership transition: company stability, operational changes, and personal job security. Providing clear answers to these fundamental questions would allow people to refocus on their work rather than speculating about their futures. A hand went up from the marketing department, Jason Winters, our creative director. Jason had been with Meridian for 7 years, having joined us from a major advertising agency. He was respected throughout the organization for his direct approach and creative insight. Is it true that Clayton sold the Denver office without approval? The question went straight to the heart of governance concerns, bypassing polite evasion in favor of substantive understanding. I appreciated that directness, even as I recognized the need for balanced disclosure. There were several transactions that did not follow proper approval protocols, I acknowledged. Those are being reviewed and, where necessary, unwound. The Denver team remains part of Meridian. This controlled transparency, acknowledging issues without detailed exposition, would be my approach throughout this transition. Employees deserved honest information about matters affecting the company, but certain details properly belonged in legal and governance channels. Another question from the back of the room came from Teresa Landry in Human Resources. What about Stella's promotion to COO? The question touched on both governance and personnel matters, complex territory that required careful navigation. Stella's relationship with Clayton was an open secret within the organization, making her proposed promotion a particularly sensitive topic. All recent personnel changes are being reviewed, I responded. Ms. Reynolds' situation will be addressed individually, as with any HR matter. The balanced response acknowledged the issue without transforming a corporate governance matter into personal drama. Whatever appropriate consequences Stella might face would result from her professional actions, not her personal relationship with Clayton. The questions continued for 20 minutes, ranging from practical concerns about client transitions to more speculative inquiries about Meridian's future strategic direction. I answered each honestly but without unnecessary detail, maintaining the balance between transparency and discretion that effective leadership required. After the meeting, Cooper approached me in the hallway. "You handled that well," he observed. Perfect balance of information and discretion. Cooper's approval meant something. As CFO, he understood the delicate balance required when discussing financial and governance matters with the broader organization. Too little information created anxiety, too much created potential legal exposure. The team needs stability, I replied, not gossip about Clayton and Stella. Speaking of which, Cooper lowered his voice slightly. Stella cleared out her office. This morning, she left a resignation letter citing hostile work environment. The strategic nature of Stella's departure wasn't surprising. By resigning rather than waiting for potential termination, she was attempting to position herself as the aggrieved party, rather than a participant in governance violations. I couldn't help but smile slightly. Clever. Attempting to position herself as the victim before we could address the Summit Partners situation. Exactly, Cooper confirmed. Legal is already preparing a response in case she files anything. The documentation of her involvement in the unauthorized transactions is extensive. Lucia's thoroughness had ensured we had comprehensive evidence of Stella's participation in the governance violations. Emails, meeting recordings, transaction authorizations bearing her digital signature. Whatever narrative she might attempt to construct, the factual record would serve as powerful counterweight. The day proceeded with methodical focus, client calls, system access resets, financial reviews. By late afternoon, A pattern had emerged of just how extensively Clayton had been operating outside proper channels. It wasn't just the Denver office sale or the Summit Partners venture. There were dozens of smaller decisions, each bending or breaking established protocols. Many of these violations would have remained undetectable without Protocol Winter's enhanced monitoring systems. Clayton had become increasingly sophisticated in concealing his actions, using intermediaries, creating plausible alternative explanations, and exploiting governance blind spots that existed within any organization. Lucia arrived at 4 with updates from her team's review, her expression grave as she settled into the chair across from my desk. We've identified $3.8 million in questionable transactions over the past year, she reported, spreading documents across my desk. Most troubling are these payments to consulting firms that appear to exist only on paper. I examined the records, recognizing Clayton's familiar patterns. He'd always preferred complexity to transparency, creating elaborate structures for what could have been straightforward transactions. I had once attributed this tendency to creativity. Now I recognized it as deliberate obfuscation. Shell companies? I asked. Lucia nodded. 3 different entities, all registered in Wyoming with minimal disclosure requirements. We're still tracking the money flow, but preliminary evidence suggests the funds were ultimately directed to personal accounts. Wyoming had become a domestic alternative to offshore havens, offering significant privacy protections and minimal reporting requirements. Clayton's choice of jurisdiction demonstrated forethought and deliberate intent to conceal. His or hers? I asked, meaning Stella. Both, it appears, though the majority went to accounts in Clayton's name only. The division was interesting, suggesting that while Clayton had included Stella in his plans, he had maintained control of the larger share of diverted funds. Even in betrayal, he had preserved his dominant position. The implications were significant. This went beyond poor corporate governance into potential fraud territory. I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of decisions to come. What are our options? I asked. Lucia's expression was solemn. We have several. We can pursue civil recovery through the divorce proceedings. We can file corporate theft charges. Or we can negotiate a settlement that includes full repayment plus his remaining shares in exchange for no criminal charges. The last option was tempting, clean, quick, final. But something in me resisted the easy path. Clayton had made choices with full awareness of their impropriety. He had betrayed not just me personally, but his fiduciary duty to the company, his obligations to employees and clients. Let's not decide immediately, I said. Continue gathering evidence. I want the complete picture before determining next steps. The decision wouldn't be about punishment, but about responsibility. Establishing that actions had consequences, that governance violations weren't merely technical matters, but ethical breaches with real impacts. I'll have comprehensive recommendations. By tomorrow afternoon, Lucia promised, gathering her materials. The forensic accounting team is working through the night. After Lucia left, I found myself alone in my office as evening approached once again. My phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the day, messages from Clayton alternating between anger, negotiation attempts, and finally, something approaching desperation. The latest simply read, "We need to talk. Not through lawyers, please." Hadn't responded to any of them. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be better handled through proper channels now. The parallel to Clayton's own governance violations wasn't lost on me. He had consistently bypassed established protocols in favor of direct action, and now sought to do the same in our personal separation. As I gathered my things to leave, I passed Clayton's former office. The nameplate had already been removed. Inside, the space looked surprisingly empty. His personal items gone, leaving only corporate furniture and generic artwork. It struck me then how little of himself Clayton had actually invested in this place. His office had always been a stage, set, impressive, but impersonal. A metaphor for how he viewed the business itself. The thought was interrupted by another message alert. Clayton again. I'm at home. Our home. I think you at least owe me a conversation after 15 years. The phrasing was calculated, appealing to history, to obligation, to a shared past that might soften my resolve. Classic Clayton, leveraging emotional connection to achieve practical objectives. I paused in the hallway, considering. On one hand, engaging directly risked emotional manipulation or confrontation without legal counsel present. On the other, Clayton and I would eventually need to address the personal aspects of our separation beyond the business implications. You have 1 hour, I texted back. I'll be there at 7. Setting clear boundaries seemed prudent. A defined time frame, established expectations, the implicit understanding that this was a courtesy rather than an obligation. As I drove to what had been our shared home for the past decade, I rehearsed boundaries in my mind. This conversation would be about closure, not negotiation, about human decency, not business transactions. The house came into view as I turned onto our street. Modern architecture with clean lines and dramatic lighting, more showcase than sanctuary. We had purchased it 4 years ago, upgrading from our previous home as Meridian's success grew. Or rather, Clayton had selected it and I had acquiesced, recognizing even then that our definitions of home were increasingly divergent. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Clayton's car parked, haphazardly, unlike his usual precise alignment, a small detail that spoke volumes about his current state. I took a deep breath before exiting my car. The house loomed before me, familiar yet suddenly foreign. No longer home, just a property to be divided like everything else in our disintegrating marriage. Clayton opened the door before I could knock. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me enter. The man standing before me bore little resemblance to the confident CEO who had laughed on the phone just days ago, telling me it was time for an upgrade. His eyes were ringed with fatigue. His posture lacked its usual commanding presence. The carefully pressed shirt was wrinkled, the designer jeans sitting awkwardly on his frame as if he'd lost weight in the span of a day. Good, I thought. Let him feel a fraction of the devastation he had planned for me. 1 hour, I reminded him, stepping into what had once been our shared life. The clock's ticking. The interior of our home reflected Clayton's mental state, disordered in a way I'd never seen before. A half-empty tumbler of whiskey sat on the coffee table. Papers were scattered across the kitchen counter. His laptop lay open, displaying spreadsheets I recognized as Meridian's financial projections. This was perhaps the most shocking aspect of the scene. Clayton had always been meticulously organized, his physical spaces as carefully controlled as his public image. The disarray spoke volumes about his psychological state in a way words couldn't convey. I noticed subtle changes throughout the space that indicated his distress. The throw pillows on the sofa, arranged each morning by the housekeeper in a specific pattern Clayton had dictated, were crushed and disorganized. A dress shirt lay, discarded on an armchair. The blinds, typically adjusted to precise angles for optimal lighting, hung unevenly. The home theater room's door stood ajar, revealing the glow of paused financial news coverage, undoubtedly reporting on rumors of Meridian's leadership changes. The business press had always taken interest in Clayton, featuring him in profiles and interviews where he'd positioned himself as Meridian's visionary founder. Today, those same outlets would be speculating about his sudden removal. "Would you like something to drink?" he offered, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. The politeness seemed absurd given the circumstances, a reflexive adherence to social norms even as everything else collapsed around him. It reminded me of how Clayton had always compartmentalized, maintaining perfect surface calm regardless of underlying turbulence. "No," I replied, remaining standing. "What did you want to discuss?" I kept my posture neutral, neither defensive nor aggressive. The body language techniques Clayton had taught me years ago, power positioning, he'd called it, now deployed in this strange final negotiation between us. Clayton ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of stress I'd seen countless times during difficult client negotiations. The carefully styled precision that normally characterized his appearance had given way to something more authentic and less controlled. "This isn't how I wanted things to go." The statement hung in the air between us, ambiguous in its sincerity. Was he expressing genuine regret for the outcome, or merely disappointment that his plans had failed? Divorce papers on our anniversary suggest otherwise. My response cut through the ambiguity, focusing on actions rather than intentions. Throughout our relationship, Clayton had been masterful at expressing noble intentions while taking contradictory actions, a pattern I'd gradually recognized over 15 years together. He had the decency to wince. The timing was a mistake. My attorney suggested making a clean break before the quarterly financials were released. The quarterly financials would have revealed several of the transactions now under investigation, including the Denver office, sale, and certain consulting payments that had actually been diverted to Summit Partners. His attorney's advice had been strategically sound but emotionally tone-deaf. "Of course he did," I said. "Because the financials would have revealed the Denver office sale, which might have affected the divorce settlement calculation." Clayton moved to the living room, sinking heavily onto the sofa. The Italian leather, selected for its precise shade of cognac and butter-soft texture, had been delivered just 6 months ago, replacing a perfectly good predecessor that Clayton had deemed dated. Another example of his constant pursuit of the newer and better. "You've always seen through everything, haven't you? Every strategy, every plan." There was something approaching admiration in his tone, professional respect from one strategist to another, even as our personal relationship disintegrated. That compartmentalization again, the ability to separate business assessment from emotional context. "Not everything," I replied, thinking of the 3 years I'd spent preparing while maintaining the facade of a stable marriage. "I didn't see your betrayal coming until it was already underway." The kitchen island where I stood provided literal distance between us. I remembered selecting the Carrara marble with Clayton. He had insisted on the perfect veining pattern, rejecting several slabs before finding one that satisfied his exacting standards. Now it formed a boundary in our final personal negotiation. "It wasn't personal," he said, reaching for his whiskey. "It was business." The phrase, delivered with practiced casualness, ignited something in me. Not just anger, but a profound weariness. With Clayton's ability to rationalize any behavior by recategorizing it. Affairs became strategic relationships. Betrayal became business restructuring. Emotional commitments became negotiable contracts. Our marriage wasn't business, Clayton. The company we built together wasn't just business. The people whose livelihoods depend on Meridian aren't just business. My voice remained measured but carried an intensity that made him look up, surprised by the controlled emotion. Throughout our relationship, I had largely adopted Clayton's preference for analytical rather than emotional communication. This deviation from pattern caught his attention. "You know what was business?" I continued. "The shell companies you created to siphon company funds. The secret deal with Stella to start a competing firm using our clients and resources. The calculated plan to leave me with 20% of what I was entitled to after 15 years of partnership." Each item was delivered with precise clarity, laying bare the distinction between genuine business activities and the personal betrayal he had attempted to disguise as strategic decision-making. Clayton set down his glass. "I never intended—" "Stop," I interrupted. "Don't insult both of us by claiming this wasn't intentional. Your plans were too detailed, too methodical for anything but deliberate calculation." The plans had indeed been meticulous. Shell companies established with carefully constructed ownership structures, client relationships systematically redirected, financial resources gradually diverted through increasingly complex transactions. Nothing about these arrangements suggested impulse or accident. For a moment, he seemed about to argue. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was a posture I'd rarely seen. Clayton Brooks acknowledging checkmate rather than attempting to redefine the game. What happens now? The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of our current positions. Clayton was still operating under the assumption that I was here to negotiate terms, that my presence in our former home indicated willingness to reach some mutually acceptable arrangement. That depends on you, I said, finally taking a seat, in the armchair across from him. The board has several options regarding the financial irregularities. Lucia is still completing her review, but the evidence of misappropriation is substantial. I kept my tone matter of fact, neither threatening nor conciliatory. This wasn't about leverage or intimidation, but simple reality. Actions had consequences, and Clayton's actions had created legal vulnerabilities that couldn't simply be negotiated away. His expression tightened. Are you threatening me with criminal charges? The question revealed his persistent tendency to personalize institutional processes, to view corporate governance and legal compliance as relationship negotiation rather than objective standards. Throughout our professional relationship, Clayton had consistently viewed rules as malleable rather than structural, as obstacles to be navigated rather than foundations to be respected. I'm stating facts, I replied calmly. Actions have consequences. Clayton, you taught me that. Indeed he had, through countless strategic discussions where he'd emphasized the importance of leverage, of position, of creating consequences for those who stood in the way of objectives. The principles he'd advocated throughout our partnership were now being applied in ways he hadn't anticipated. A bitter laugh escaped him. So this is payback. Again, the personalization, recasting governance enforcement as emotional response, corporate fiduciary duty as relationship vendetta. Clayton's framework consistently centered his experience and interpretation, positioning others' actions as responses to him rather than independent ethical choices. No, this is governance. The company has fiduciary responsibilities to its shareholders and clients. Ignoring financial misconduct would violate those responsibilities. The distinction mattered, not just legally, but ethically. The investigation into Clayton's activities wasn't personally motivated, but institutionally required. The same governance principles would apply regardless of who had committed the violations. He leaned forward, desperation edging into his voice. I can return the money, all of it. And my shares, you can have them. Just don't destroy everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. Days ago, he had been prepared to destroy my financial security, my professional standing, my future, all without hesitation. Now he was begging for mercy from the very person he'd planned to discard. It wasn't satisfaction I felt in that moment, but a profound sadness for what we'd become. Two people who had once built something meaningful together, reduced to negotiating the terms of their mutual disentanglement. I'll present your offer to the board, I said, neither accepting nor rejecting it. They'll make the final decision regarding Meridian's response. The board that you control, he noted. The properly constituted governance body, I corrected. Which I happen to chair as majority shareholder. The distinction wasn't semantic, but substantive. My authority derived not from personal influence, but from legitimate organizational structure, the very framework Clayton had dismissed as unnecessary. Bureaucracy throughout our partnership. Clayton reached for a folder on the coffee table, retrieving several papers. I've drawn up a proposed settlement, full transfer of my remaining shares to you, return of all funds from the questioned transactions, and a comprehensive non-compete agreement. The documents were neatly prepared, suggesting he'd spent significant time with his attorney developing these terms. Even in apparent disarray, Clayton remained strategic, preparing fallback positions and alternative scenarios. I took the documents but didn't open them. "I'll have Stanley review these." "Of course," he said, a flash of his old bitterness returning. "Everything by the book." "The book exists for a reason, Clayton. If you'd followed it, we wouldn't be here." We sat in silence for a moment, 15 years of shared history hanging in the air between us. Despite everything, I felt a pang of grief for what we'd lost. Not just the marriage, but the partnership that had once seemed unbreakable. The silence stretched, filling the expansive living room that had been designed more for impression than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city lights below, a view Clayton had prioritized when selecting this house. "Success should be visible," he'd said during our house hunt. "It should remind you daily of what you've achieved." Now that carefully curated backdrop of success seemed hollow, beautiful but empty, like so much else in our shared life. "What about the house?" he finally asked. The question was practical but loaded with subtext. This wasn't just about real estate, but about the life we'd constructed, the physical manifestation of our partnership now requiring division like everything else. I glanced around at the modern architecture he'd insisted on, the minimalist design that had never quite felt like home to me. The clean lines and dramatic spaces that had impressed clients and colleagues, but had always felt more like a showroom than a sanctuary. "You can keep it. I've already found a new place." My answer clearly surprised him. Clayton had anticipated negotiation over the house, likely assuming it represented a significant emotional attachment for me as it did for him. Its value as a status symbol made it a presumed priority in his understanding of my motivations. His head snapped up. "You have? When?" The genuine shock in his expression confirmed how completely he had misread me over recent years. While he'd been planning my removal from Meridian, I'd been establishing my independence in ways he'd never suspected. 2 years ago, I admitted. "A condo downtown that I've been renovating slowly. It's ready when I am." The condo represented far more than alternative housing. It embodied my psychological preparation for this moment. While maintaining the appearance of commitment to our shared home, I had been creating a space that reflected my individual aesthetic and priorities, a sanctuary designed around my needs rather than impression management. Another piece of protocol. Winter he hadn't anticipated. Another preparation for the day I'd known would eventually come. Clayton shook his head slowly. 3 years of planning, a secret condo, a hidden ownership structure. You created a complete escape route while sleeping beside me every night. There was something like reluctant admiration in his tone, professional respect for strategic thoroughness, even in the midst of personal betrayal. It was quintessentially Clayton to appreciate the tactical brilliance of my preparations, even as they undermined his own plans. "Yes," I acknowledged, "just as you created a complete replacement plan while telling me you loved me. We've both been living double lives, Clayton. The difference is my secondary life was about protection, not betrayal. The distinction mattered. To me, not for Clayton's validation, but for my own integrity. My actions had been defensive rather than predatory, preserving rather than appropriating." He had no response to that. His eyes drifted to the far wall where a black and white photograph hung. The two of us at Meridian's 5-year anniversary celebration, champagne glasses raised in triumph. It had been a genuine moment of partnership, a milestone achievement. We'd built together through countless late nights and shared sacrifices. I followed his gaze, remembering that night clearly. We had been truly aligned then, complementary skills serving a shared vision. My operational excellence paired with his client magnetism had created something remarkable, a harmony that had produced success neither of us could have achieved. "Alone, when did it change?" I asked quietly, the question emerging unbidden. "When did you start seeing me as an obstacle rather than a partner?" The question caught us both by surprise, a momentary departure from the practical matters of divorce and asset division into something more fundamental. For a brief moment, the professional masks dropped, revealing the human uncertainty beneath. Clayton considered the question with unexpected seriousness. I don't know exactly. After the Thompson account, maybe. The Thompson account, a major client acquisition 3 years ago that had significantly elevated Meridian's industry profile. Clayton had led the pitch presentation, securing a multinational client that transformed our company's reputation and revenue projections. You restructured our service delivery model without consulting me, he continued. Created all those additional oversight protocols that slowed down implementation. I remembered the changes clearly. Governance improvements designed to ensure consistent quality as we scaled to serve larger clients. Protocols that had protected both Meridian and Thompson from potential compliance issues. Those protocols prevented 3 major implementation errors, I pointed out. They protected both the client and Meridian. They constrained innovation, Clayton countered. Made everything procedural instead of responsive. After that, you started questioning every creative approach to client solutions. The divergence in our perspectives was striking. What I had viewed as necessary quality assurance, Clayton had experienced as creative constraint. What I had considered prudent risk management, he had interpreted as innovation obstruction. I was protecting what we built, I said, ensuring consistent quality as we scaled. You were building bureaucracy, he replied, without heat now, just stating his perception. Forms and approvals and documentation requirements. Stella understood the need for flexibility, for adapting quickly to client needs without endless review cycles. And there it was, the fundamental philosophical difference that had driven us apart professionally before the personal betrayal had even begun. Clayton valued speed and perceived responsiveness. I prioritized consistency and structural integrity. I checked my watch. 45 minutes had passed. Our hour was drawing to a close, and we had barely touched on the practical, matters that would need resolution through our attorneys. Is there anything else we need to discuss tonight? Clayton seemed to deflate further. The mention of our limited time frame appeared to reinforce the finality of the situation, that our 15-year partnership had been reduced to a 60-minute conversation in a house that would soon belong only to him. What will you tell people? About us? An interesting question. His first concern about reputation rather than finances or legal exposure. Throughout our marriage and business partnership, Clayton had been acutely conscious of public perception, carefully cultivating his image as a visionary leader and success story. The truth, I replied. That we've decided to separate after 15 years, that the business will continue under established leadership, that we both ask for privacy during this transition. My proposed narrative was factual without being vindictive, acknowledging the separation without detailing the betrayal that precipitated it. It provided closure without unnecessary damage to reputations or relationships. That's it? No mention of Stella or the irregularities? There was genuine surprise in his question, revealing again how fundamentally he had misunderstood me. Clayton had approached our divorce from an adversarial framework, assuming I would seek not just protection, but retribution. Contrary to what you might think, Clayton, I don't want to destroy you. I just refuse to let you destroy me. I meant it sincerely. Despite the pain of betrayal, despite the years of gradual erasure from Meridian's public narrative, I took no satisfaction in Clayton's professional diminishment. My goal had always been protection, not punishment, safeguarding what we'd built rather than dismantling his future. Relief flickered across his face. Thank you for that, at least. The gratitude seemed genuine if limited. Appreciation for professional. Discretion if not forgiveness for personal betrayal. Even now, Clayton's priorities remained reputation-focused, his concerns centered on public narrative rather than private reconciliation. I stood, gathering my belongings. I should go. Have your attorney contact Stanley about the settlement proposal. My movement toward departure shifted something in Clayton's demeanor. The confident negotiator disappeared completely, leaving someone more vulnerable than I had seen in years. Was any of it real? He asked suddenly. The last 3 years, I mean. Was anything genuine? The question revealed a glimpse of the man I had first married, capable of introspection, concerned with authenticity beyond strategic positioning. It was the most human moment we'd shared in years, a brief connection amid the wreckage of our relationship. I paused, considering the question seriously. 3 years of maintained appearances, 3 years of documented betrayal, 3 years of parallel lives intersecting in a marriage that existed more in public perception than private reality. My commitment to what we built together was real. My hope that you might remember why we started this journey was real. My grief when I realized you wouldn't is real too. It wasn't the complete absolution he might have wanted, but it was the honest assessment I could offer. Despite the strategic preparations of Protocol Winter, despite the emotional walls I'd constructed for self-protection, there had been authentic moments amid the performance, genuine grief for the partnership we'd lost. He nodded slowly, accepting. This partial truth. I moved toward the front door, passing through rooms filled with carefully selected furnishings and artwork, each piece chosen to create a specific impression rather than express a personal aesthetic. The house had always been a statement about success rather than a reflection of shared identity. At the door, I turned back one last time. The tableau was striking. Clayton alone in the cavernous house we'd purchased to celebrate Meridian's first major expansion, surrounded by the trappings of success but abandoned by its substance. "Goodbye, Clayton," I said quietly. "Goodbye, Nikki," he replied, not looking up. Outside, the night air carried the first hint of autumn crispness, a transitional season appropriate to this moment of ending and beginning. I descended the steps from his front door with a curious lightness, as if setting down a weight I'd carried for years. As I drove away, I felt the weight of the past 3 years lifting gradually. There would be more challenges ahead, finalizing the divorce, stabilizing the company, rebuilding trust with clients and employees. But the hardest part, maintaining the facade while preparing for this inevitable moment, was finally over. The dashboard clock read 8:12 p.m. Our anniversary, a day that had begun with divorce papers and ended with separation, was drawing to a close. The symmetry would have appealed to Clayton's sense of narrative, though the outcome was far from what he had envisioned when setting today's events in motion. My thoughts turned to the evidence Lucia had presented during the board meeting, the systematic attempt to appropriate Meridian, to erase my contribution, to claim exclusively what we had built together. A methodical betrayal years in planning, undermined by the very thoroughness Clayton had always dismissed as unnecessary. Clayton had misjudged me fundamentally. He'd mistaken my attention to detail for obsessiveness rather than thoroughness. He'd interpreted my careful documentation as bureaucracy rather than diligence. Most critically, he'd confused my patience for passivity. 3 years ago, when I discovered his betrayal was beginning, I could have confronted him immediately. Could have demanded explanations, threatened exposure, insisted on counseling. The emotional response might have been satisfying temporarily, but ultimately destructive. Instead, I chose the strategic path. Not out of coldness, but out of respect for what we'd built together. The company deserved protection, the employees deserved stability, and I deserved security. Traffic thinned as I turned toward downtown, toward the condo that represented my independent future rather than our shared past. The building came into view, a restored historic structure with modern amenities, character with convenience, substance with style. Everything the glass and steel showcase house we'd shared had never been. Protocol Winter hadn't been about revenge. It had been about survival, of the business, of my future, of my self-respect. In executing it, I hadn't become like Clayton. I'd simply used the skills he'd always undervalued to counter the threat he posed. As I pulled into the garage of my downtown condo, my actual home now, I allowed myself a moment of recognition. The anniversary that had begun with such cruelty had ended with clarity. Clayton had intended it as an ending. Instead, it had become a beginning. The elevator carried me to the 12th floor, to the space I'd been preparing in parallel with my professional strategy. The door opened to warm lighting, comfortable furnishings chosen for enjoyment rather than impression, artwork selected for personal resonance rather than investment value. I moved through rooms that reflected my own aesthetic rather than Clayton's curated prestige, functional but beautiful, sophisticated without pretension. This space hadn't been designed to showcase success but to provide sanctuary, not to impress visitors but to nurture occupants. In the kitchen, designed for actual cooking rather than mere appearance, I poured a glass of wine. The Cabernet had been aging for 5 years, a bottle I'd purchased to eventually celebrate a significant milestone. Tonight qualified, though not in the way I might once have anticipated. My phone buzzed with messages, updates from Cooper about secured systems, questions from Lucia about tomorrow's legal filings, confirmation from Erica about the all-hands meeting. The work would continue, the challenges would evolve, but the foundation was secure. I moved to the living room windows, looking out over the city lights. From this vantage point, I could see our office building in the distance, illuminated against the night sky. Meridian continued, its operations secured, its future reoriented toward the values and vision that had been increasingly sidelined under Clayton's leadership. Time for an upgrade indeed. Part 6. The rebuilding 6 months passed with remarkable speed. Winter melted into spring, and spring blossomed into early summer. Meridian not only survived the transition, but thrived under reorganized leadership. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, Clayton's former space, which I'd redesigned completely. Gone were the imposing dark furnishings and intimidating layout. In their place, a more open configuration that encouraged collaboration rather than reinforcing hierarchy. Erica knocked lightly on the doorframe, tablet in hand. The quarterly. Numbers are finalized. Cooper says they're the best we've seen in 3 years. I smiled, gesturing for her to come in. Let me guess. Clients appreciate having dedicated teams again instead of being shuffled between whoever was available? Exactly, she confirmed, taking a seat. The Knox Group has expanded their contract by 30%. They specifically mentioned consistent leadership as the deciding factor. The irony wasn't lost on me. Clayton had always insisted that clients wanted the flash, the performance, the big promises. What they'd actually wanted was reliability, expertise, and follow-through, the very qualities he'd dismissed as unimportant. And the Denver office? I asked. Fully reintegrated and performing above projections. John Manning accepted the position as regional director. He's been instrumental in rebuilding morale there. This was particularly satisfying. The Denver team had been blindsided by Clayton's unauthorized sale of their division. Unwinding that transaction and restoring their place within Meridian had been among my first priorities. How are the governance changes being received? I asked, referring to the comprehensive restructuring we'd implemented. Clearer approval protocols, more transparent reporting, distributed decision-making. Erica's expression was telling. There was some resistance initially from Clayton's old guard. But the results speak for themselves. Decision-making is actually faster now that we have clear processes instead of waiting for Clayton's sporadic attention. My intercom buzzed. Ms. Harlow, Mr. Weber is here to see you. Send him in, I replied. Stanley entered moments later, carrying his characteristic leather portfolio. Erica excused herself, giving us privacy. The final divorce papers are ready for your signature, Stanley announced without preamble. He'd always appreciated directness, one of the reasons I'd chosen him as my attorney. I gestured for him to sit. And Clayton has already signed? Yesterday. Stanley spread the documents on my desk. The terms are exactly as negotiated. You retain full ownership of Meridian through your 93% stake. Clayton keeps the house and his personal investments. The non-compete clause remains in effect for 5 years. And most importantly, he has reimbursed all misappropriated funds with interest. I nodded, scanning the key provisions. And the criminal charges? Dropped, per the agreement. Though the regulatory investigation continues independently. That was beyond our control. This had been the most difficult decision, whether to push for criminal charges regarding the financial misconduct. Ultimately, the board had agreed that company interests were best served by full financial recovery and Clayton's complete separation rather than a protracted legal battle. I signed where indicated, feeling a curious sense of completion rather than sadness. The marriage had effectively ended 3 years ago when I discovered Clayton's betrayal. This was merely the formal acknowledgement of what had long been reality. Any word on where he's landed? I asked, handing the signed papers back to Stanley. Consulting for a firm in Arizona. Much smaller than Meridian. Stella isn't with him, from what I hear. That didn't surprise me. Stella had always been ambitious. When Clayton's plans collapsed, taking his resources and reputation with them, she had undoubtedly moved on to more promising opportunities. And the board meeting this afternoon? Stanley inquired, changing the subject as he packed away the divorce papers. Standard quarterly review, plus discussion of the expansion proposal. He nodded approvingly. The Chicago acquisition? Yes. The numbers look promising, and it gives us presence in a key market. Cooper has developed a solid integration plan. After Stanley left, I spent some time reviewing the expansion documents. The Chicago firm complemented our existing services, perfectly bringing specialized expertise that would enhance our overall offerings. Unlike Clayton's impulsive acquisitions, this one had been thoroughly researched, with clear integration strategies and realistic projections. My phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. Celebration dinner tonight? The team wants to mark the occasion. I smiled, knowing she meant both the finalized divorce and the expected approval of the Chicago acquisition. Absolutely. Marcello's at 7? Perfect, came the reply. Cooper and Erica already confirmed. The afternoon board meeting went exactly as anticipated. The quarterly results impressed everyone, with client retention at 97% and new business up 22%. The Chicago acquisition received unanimous approval, with thoughtful questions and constructive suggestions, rather than the rubber stamp approach that had characterized the board under Clayton's influence. As I prepared to leave for the day, I passed by the company timeline displayed in the main reception area. A new addition had recently been installed, a photo of our expanded leadership team at the Industry Awards ceremony last month, where Meridian had been recognized for excellence in corporate governance reform. The irony of that particular award wasn't lost on anyone who knew our recent history. The governance failures under Clayton had ultimately led to the creation of a model that others were now emulating. Arriving at Marcello's that evening, I found Lucia, Cooper, and Erica already seated at our usual corner table. The restaurant had been our unofficial meeting place during the entire protocol winter phase, chosen specifically because Clayton avoided Italian food and would never unexpectedly appear. To new beginnings, Lucia proposed as our wine was poured, raising her glass in a toast. And to proper endings, Cooper added with a knowing smile. We clinked glasses, these three who had become more than colleagues through the challenges of the past year. They had been allies, confidants, and ultimately friends who understood what we had accomplished together. Have you heard from him? Erica asked after our first course arrived. Not directly, I replied. The divorce was finalized today. All communication went through attorneys. Cooper nodded approvingly. Cleaner that way. I saw his profile on LinkedIn, Lucia mentioned. He's updated it to downplay his Meridian connection. Now he's positioning himself as a strategic advisor, focused on Disruptive innovation. We all shared a knowing look. Clayton's version of disruptive innovation had nearly destroyed the company he claimed to have built. Enough about the past, I said, turning the conversation. Let's talk about Chicago. Cooper, walk us through the integration timeline. As dinner progressed, our discussion moved confidently between business strategy and personal plans. Lucia had finally agreed to take the vacation she'd been postponing for years. Cooper was mentoring a promising financial analyst he'd recruited from a competitor. Erica was implementing a leadership development program she'd designed for our mid-level managers. These were the conversations Clayton had always dismissed as administrative details beneath his attention. Yet these details, the careful nurturing of talent, the thoughtful planning of processes, the consistent building of culture, were what had made Meridian resilient enough to survive his attempted destruction. Walking back to my condo later that evening, I reflected on the strange journey of the past year. An anniversary marked by divorce papers had set in motion events that ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed what I'd spent 15 years building. Clayton had intended to discard me, assuming I would crumble without his brilliant leadership. Instead, freed from the constraints of his ego and impulsiveness, both the company and I had flourished. My phone buzzed with an email notification, the Chicago firm's leadership announcing the acquisition to their team, expressing excitement about joining Meridian. Their message emphasized our reputation for collaborative leadership and ethical governance, precisely the values Clayton had always considered expendable. I smiled to myself as I entered my condo building. The night doorman greeted me warmly. "Good evening, Ms. Harlow. Busy day?" "Productive," I replied. "Very productive indeed." 1 year to the day after receiving those divorce papers, I found myself in San Francisco for the annual Industry Leadership Conference. Meridian had been invited to present our case study on corporate governance transformation, a thinly veiled reference to our post-Clayton restructuring that had become something of a legend in business circles. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. A year ago today, I had been standing in my kitchen, staring at divorce papers with a yellow sticky note. Now I was preparing to address 500 industry leaders about organizational resilience and ethical leadership. My presentation was scheduled for the afternoon, which gave me the morning to attend other sessions and network with potential clients. The conference was being held at the Fairmont, its elegant architecture a fitting backdrop for the gathering of industry elite. I was reviewing my presentation notes over coffee in the hotel restaurant when a familiar voice caught me off guard. "Nikki." I looked up to find Clayton standing beside my table, looking both uncomfortable and determined. He wore an expensive suit as always, but it hung slightly loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight. The confident posture that had once seemed so natural to him was noticeably forced. "Clayton," I acknowledged, maintaining my composure despite the surprise. "I didn't know you were attending." "Last-minute decision," he replied. "I saw Meridian on the presenter list." He hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair across from Mice. "Me." "May I?" I considered refusing but decided against it. Whatever he wanted to say, better to hear it directly than wonder. "Briefly, I have a session to attend in 20 minutes. He sat, placing his conference badge face down on the table, a small gesture that spoke volumes about his diminished professional status. "You look well," he offered, an opening platitude that felt hollow given our history. "Thank you," I replied, without returning the compliment. "How's Arizona?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He hadn't expected me to know his whereabouts. "Challenging. Smaller market, different clientele." I nodded, waiting for him to get to the point of this. "Unexpected approach?" Clayton cleared his throat. "I saw the announcement about the Chicago acquisition and the industry award for governance reform." He paused. "The company is doing better than ever." "Yes," I confirmed simply. "Without me," he added, a statement rather than a question. I met his gaze directly. The company is doing better with proper governance and collaborative leadership. The absence of any particular individual is less relevant than the presence of effective systems. He almost smiled at that. Always the diplomat. Always precise, I corrected. There's a difference. Clayton's expression shifted to something more genuine, the practiced charm falling away. I deserved that. And more. He took a breath. I've had a lot of time to reflect this past year. About what I threw away, what I destroyed. I checked my watch pointedly. If this is an apology tour, I appreciate the gesture, but it isn't necessary. It's not for you, he said quickly. Or not just for you. It's... He struggled to find the words, unusual for someone who had always been verbally agile. I need to understand what happened, how I could have misjudged everything so completely. This was unexpected. The Clayton I had known would have constructed a narrative that minimized his culpability, that framed his failures as circumstances beyond his control. What do you mean? I asked, genuine curiosity overriding my initial guardedness. I had everything, he said quietly. A successful company, a capable partner, respect in the industry, and I risked it all for, what? A fantasy of being unrestrained? Some notion that I could do better without the constraints of proper process? I studied him, trying to discern if this self-reflection was genuine or merely a performance for my benefit. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only one who would understand the magnitude of my miscalculation. He met my eyes directly. I didn't just lose a wife or a company. I lost the foundation everything else was built on, the credibility I'd spent a career establishing. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt a flicker of something approaching sympathy. Not for the consequences he was facing, those were entirely deserved, but for the belated recognition of what he had carelessly discarded. What happened with Stella? I asked, more from curiosity than concern. A bitter smile crossed his face. She found a more promising prospect within 2 weeks of the collapse. Last I heard, she's working for Westbrook Consulting, still in client. Relations? I nodded, unsurprised. Stella had always been strategic about advancing her career. Clayton had simply been a vehicle for her ambitions, just as she had been for his. And the regulatory investigation? I asked. He grimaced. Ongoing. Their processes are thorough. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The thoroughness he had always dismissed as unnecessary bureaucracy was now methodically documenting his financial misdeeds. Clayton glanced at his watch. I should let you go to your session. He stood, then hesitated. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Nikki, or a second chance. Those ships have sailed, and rightly so. Then what are you asking for? I inquired, genuinely curious about his purpose in initiating this conversation. Nothing, really, he admitted. Just the opportunity to acknowledge to your face that you were right. About the business. About governance. About most things, actually. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. I found myself nodding in acceptance of this unexpected acknowledgement. Good luck with your presentation, he added, preparing to leave. Though you won't need it. You always were the better strategist. As he turned to go, I found myself asking the question that had lingered since that day in his office a year ago. Clayton, if you could go back, what would you have done differently? He paused, considering the question with unexpected seriousness. Listened, he finally said, to your concerns about governance, to your insights about client needs, to your warnings about proper protocols. He shook his head ruefully. I was so convinced that rules were just obstacles to my vision that I never recognized they were actually the foundation everything else depended on. With that, he walked away, shoulders slightly stooped, a sharp contrast to the commanding presence he had once projected. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor regret, just a curious sense of closure. Clayton's recognition of his errors changed nothing about the past year, yet somehow it smoothed a rough edge I hadn't realized was still there. My phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. "Front row seats secured for your presentation. Cooper says, break a leg." I smiled, gathering my materials. The past was finally settled. The future, with its Chicago expansion, governance innovations, and growing industry recognition, stretched before me with possibilities I was only beginning to explore as I walked toward the conference hall. I found myself reflecting on the strange symmetry of the day. A year ago, Clayton had intended our anniversary to mark the end of everything I'd built. Instead, it had become the beginning of something stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more successful than what had existed before. Sometimes, I mused, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about moving forward. The main conference hall was already filling when I arrived. Business leaders, industry analysts, and consultants found their seats as the previous session concluded. I recognized several competitors among the audience, undoubtedly curious about Meridian's remarkable turnaround. Backstage, I reviewed my slides one final time. The presentation had been meticulously prepared, balancing technical governance details with the human elements of organizational transformation. It told our story without explicitly naming Clayton or detailing the personal betrayal that had precipitated the change. Some things remained private, even in a case study. The moderator, a well-respected business school professor, approached with a warm smile. "Ms. Harlow, we're looking forward to your presentation. There's considerable buzz about Meridian's governance innovations." "Thank you," I replied. "Though I should note we didn't set out to be innovative. We simply committed to doing things properly." She nodded appreciatively. Sometimes that's the most revolutionary approach of all. As I waited for my introduction, I scanned the audience through the slight gap in the curtains. Lucia and Cooper sat in the front row as promised, alongside Erica, who must have arrived that morning. Several of our major clients were present as well. And there, near the back, Clayton, seated alone, expression unreadable from this distance. His presence was unexpected. Our brief morning encounter had felt like closure, not a prelude to further interaction. Yet here he was, presumably to witness firsthand the public discussion of the company he'd tried to dismantle. The moderator's voice pulled me back to the present moment. "Our next speaker has led one of the most remarkable corporate transformations in recent years. Under her leadership, Meridian Consulting has not only survived a major governance challenge, but emerged stronger, with industry-leading client retention rates and a governance model that's being studied at business schools nationwide. Please welcome Nicole Harlow, CEO of Meridian Consulting." The applause was encouraging as I stepped onto the stage. Public speaking had never been my favorite activity. That had been Clayton's domain. But over the past year, I'd grown comfortable with the role of visible leadership, recognizing its importance in building confidence with clients and employees alike. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady. 18 months ago, Meridian Consulting faced a pivotal moment. Not a financial crisis or market disruption, but a governance challenge that threatened the very foundation of our organization. I advanced to the first slide, which showed our company's performance metrics before and after the restructuring, the stark contrast telling its own story. What you're seeing isn't just improved numbers. It's the quantifiable result of aligning governance with values, of ensuring that processes support purpose rather than impede it. Over the next 40 minutes, I detailed our journey, the identification of governance gaps, the implementation of transparent protocols, the cultural shift from charismatic leadership to systematic accountability. Throughout, I kept the focus on principles rather than personalities, on lessons rather than blame. The most significant realization, I continued nearing the conclusion, wasn't that our previous governance was flawed. It was understanding that governance isn't separate from strategy. It is strategy. It's not bureaucracy that constrains Vision. It's the infrastructure that enables vision to become sustainable reality. As I spoke, I noticed Clayton shift in his seat. These weren't just abstract principles to him, but painful personal lessons. At Meridian, we discovered that when governance is strong, individual contributions become more valuable, not less. When processes are clear, creativity flourishes rather than diminishes. When accountability is consistent, trust deepens throughout the organization. The final slide displayed our current leadership structure, a collaborative model that distributed authority while maintaining clear decision paths. The traditional image of corporate leadership often focuses on the solitary visionary, the charismatic individual who drives change through sheer force of personality. What we've discovered is that real organizational resilience comes not from individual brilliance, but from systematic excellence. Excellence that survives and thrives regardless of any single person's presence or absence. I concluded with our outcomes: client growth, employee satisfaction, industry recognition, and opened the floor for questions. The first came from an industry analyst I recognized from business publications. Ms. Harlow, your governance model emphasizes distributed decision-making, yet you maintain a traditional CEO role. How do you reconcile these approaches? An excellent question that went straight to the heart of our transformation. The CEO's role in our model isn't to centralize decision-making, but to ensure the integrity of the decision-making process, I explained. My primary responsibility isn't to make every decision, but to guarantee that decisions are made at the appropriate level, with proper information and accountability. Leadership becomes less about control and more about creating conditions where good decisions naturally emerge. Several more questions followed, about client transitions, metrics for measuring governance effectiveness, and implementation challenges. Each reflected genuine interest in the substance of our approach, rather than the drama of our story. The final question came from near the back of the room. Your presentation emphasizes process and systems, but transformation usually requires a catalyst. What specific event triggered Meridian's governance revolution? I looked up to locate the questioner and found myself meeting Clayton's gaze directly. He had raised the question deliberately, offering me a public opportunity to expose his betrayal if I chose to. The room fell silent, awaiting my response. I could feel Lucia and Cooper tensing in the front row, uncertain how I would handle this deliberate provocation, if that's what it was. But looking at Clayton, I saw not challenge, but something closer to acceptance. Perhaps even a desire for accountability. Transformation indeed requires a catalyst, I acknowledged, addressing the entire room rather than just Clayton. In Meridian's case, we experienced what I'll call a significant misalignment between leadership actions and organizational values. That misalignment created an opportunity to examine our fundamental assumptions about how decisions should be made and accountability maintained. I paused, then continued with careful precision. The specifics are less important than the principle. Governance isn't something you implement after a crisis. It's something you establish to prevent crisis. We had the opportunity to learn that lesson more dramatically than most. The moderator sensed the weight of the moment and stepped in. That seems like an excellent note to conclude on. Please join me in thanking Nicole Harlow for this insightful presentation. The applause was enthusiastic as I gathered my materials. As I left the stage, I caught a final glimpse of Clayton slipping out a side door, whether from discomfort at my diplomatic handling of his question or simple recognition that our chapter was truly closed. I couldn't tell. In the hallway, Lucia, Cooper, and Erica waited with congratulatory smiles. Perfect balance, Lucia commented, echoing Cooper's assessment from months ago. Professional without being impersonal. Was that Clayton who asked the last question? Erica asked quietly. I nodded. He attended the full presentation. Cooper's expression darkened slightly. Looking for ammunition, or just morbid curiosity? Neither, I think, I replied, surprising myself with the assessment. I believe he was looking for understanding. Our conversation was interrupted by a stream of attendees approaching with questions, business cards, and invitations to continue discussions over coffee. The interest was gratifying, not just in me personally, but in the governance principles we'd implemented. By the time we broke for lunch, I had scheduled follow-up conversations with 3 potential clients and accepted an invitation to speak at a prestigious business school. Clayton was nowhere to be seen. As we settled at our lunch table, Erica raised her water glass in a quiet toast. To the future of Meridian. And to its architect, Cooper added, nodding toward me. I smiled, accepting their acknowledgement while knowing the truth was more nuanced. Meridian's transformation hadn't been my solo creation, but the collective work of everyone at the table, and many others back at the office who had embraced the new direction. To all of us, I amended, raising my own glass, and to proper governance. We clinked glasses, united not just by what we'd overcome, but by what we were building together. 2 years after that fateful anniversary, I found myself back in our original office building. Meridian had long since outgrown the space, relocating to larger headquarters that better accommodated our expanded team. But this building housed our first major client, the Knox Group, and our quarterly strategy meeting had brought me back to familiar territory. As I waited for the elevator in the marble-floored lobby, memories cascaded through my mind. Late nights, developing proposals, early morning strategy sessions, the gradual evolution from hopeful startup to established consultancy. So much of our early foundation had been laid within these walls. The receptionist smiled in recognition as I signed in. Ms. Harlow, it's been ages. Knox has been singing your praises nonstop. They've been wonderful partners, I replied, returning her warm greeting. Sometimes the original relationships remain the strongest. Isn't that the truth? She agreed, handing me a visitor badge. Mr. Rossman is expecting you on 17. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 17th floor. As the doors began to close, a hand reached through the gap, triggering the safety sensor. Sorry, just catching. The voice cut off abruptly as recognition dawned on both sides. Clayton stood frozen for a moment, clearly as surprised by this encounter as I was. 2 years had changed him visibly. The polished corporate appearance had softened into something more authentic, still professional but lacking the carefully cultivated image he'd once maintained. Nikki, he acknowledged with a nod, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the 14th floor. Clayton, I didn't realize you were back in town. 6 months now, he replied, maintaining a respectful distance as the elevator began its ascent. I'm with Archer Davis on 14. Archer Davis was a mid-sized firm with a solid reputation, nowhere near Meridian's scale, but respectable. Not where Clayton would have placed himself 3 years ago, but a legitimate position nonetheless. How is it? I asked, genuine curiosity rather than polite formality. He considered the question thoughtfully. Challenging in the right ways? Smaller projects? More direct client involvement? A slight smile. More attention to governance and documentation than they were used to. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The very principles he had once dismissed had become his new professional foundation. The Chicago expansion is impressive, he offered after a brief pause. I saw the announcement about the new financial services division. I nodded, slightly surprised he was tracking Meridian's growth. Cooper's been leading that initiative. He has a particular talent for integrating new teams while maintaining cultural consistency. Always did, Clayton agreed. I should have listened to him more often. The elevator slowed at the 14th floor. As the doors opened, Clayton hesitated. I saw your feature in Business Leadership Monthly, he said. The governance model you've developed is being adopted across the industry. It's quite an achievement. Thank you, I replied, recognizing the genuine acknowledgement in his tone. He stepped out of the elevator, then turned back. For what it's worth, Nikki, you've built something remarkable, something much better than what existed before. Before I could respond, the doors began closing. Our brief encounter ended with a simple nod of mutual recognition, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but something approaching respect. The Knox meeting proceeded perfectly, our long-standing relationship translating into efficient collaboration and strategic alignment. Their CEO, James Rossman, had been with us from the beginning and had witnessed firsthand the transformation of Meridian. I have to say, he commented as we wrapped up, watching Meridian's evolution these past few years has been fascinating. When Clayton was removed, I'll admit I had concerns about continuity. I smiled, appreciating his candor. Many did. Change at the top often creates uncertainty. But you didn't just maintain continuity, he continued. You created something fundamentally stronger. Our team has never felt better supported. After the meeting, I found myself with an unexpected free hour before my next appointment. On impulse, I decided to visit our old office space on the 12th floor. The building directory showed it was now occupied by a tech startup, the circle of business life continuing as ever. Standing outside those familiar doors, I could almost see the ghosts of our younger selves, Clayton and I, full of ambition and shared purpose, building something from nothing through sheer determination and complementary skills. My phone buzzed with a text from Erica. London office launch confirmed for September. Board approval unanimous. I smiled, replying with, "My congratulations." The London expansion represented our first international presence, a milestone we had once discussed with Clayton in those early days, but had never quite prioritized under his leadership. As I turned to leave, the startup's door opened and a young woman emerged, startled to find someone in the hallway. "Oh, can I help you?" she asked. "Just reminiscing," I explained with a smile. "My company started in this space years ago." Her expression brightened. "You're Meridian Consulting? We've heard the stories about this being your original office. It's like startup folklore around here." I laughed. "I'm not sure we've reached folklore status yet." "Are you kidding? Female-led company, governance innovation, industry awards? You're basically what every founder aspires to build." Her enthusiasm was genuine and unexpected. "Would you mind if I grabbed a quick photo for our team? They'll never believe who I ran into." After obliging with a photo and exchanging business cards, her name was Tara, and their company was developing AI solutions for sustainability metrics. I headed back to the elevator with a curious sense of perspective. 3 years ago, I had received divorce papers on my anniversary, setting in motion events that could have destroyed everything I'd built. Instead, that moment of betrayal had catalyzed transformation, not just of Meridian, but of myself. The elevator doors opened, and I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd encountered Clayton minutes earlier. Our paths had diverged permanently, yet there was something fitting about this brief crossing, a reminder of where we had started and how far we had each traveled since. As I descended to the lobby, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. The anniversary that Clayton had intended to mark the end had instead become a beginning. The company he had tried to claim exclusively as his creation had flourished beyond what either of us had initially envisioned. The capabilities he had, dismissed, had proven to be the very foundation of sustained success. Outside, the summer sun illuminated the city skyline. Familiar buildings alongside new construction, the urban landscape evolving just as Meridian had. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Cooper about our upcoming strategy retreat. Smiled as I typed my response, then paused to look back at the building where so much had begun. The past would always be there, informing but not constraining the future we were creating. Sometimes, I mused as I headed toward my next meeting, the most significant chapters of our lives begin precisely when we think the story is ending. Clayton's attempt to discard me had instead freed me to build something stronger than either of us could have imagined separately. His anniversary gift of divorce papers had ultimately given me something far more valuable than the diamond earrings he'd hinted at. It had given me clarity, purpose, and the opportunity to discover my own capabilities without the shadow of his ego. As anniversary presents go, I reflected with a quiet smile. It had turned out to be quite remarkable indeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.